So, what went wrong? Last time we talked about the beauty of creation, God's good work, how he looked upon humans and said they are very good. But something obviously went wrong. As good as this world is, it's also very clear that it's not what it's supposed to be. And just the fact that we know something is wrong, like we look at the world, we experience life, and we know something's off, this isn't the way it should be, is testimony to a higher standard, to God's existence and God's moral order over creation. We have this innate sense of what is right and what is wrong. And so we know that this world is not right. It has gone wrong. So how has it gone wrong? It's hard to know even where to start. I think of those movies when, like The Fifth Element or something like that, when an alien visits Earth and or an AI is trying to figure out this world and downloads all the information, goes through all the media footage and the stories throughout our history, and you see these images of war and violence, of pestilence, of oppression and injustice, of beatings and misuse of power, and after they're done, everybody's come to the conclusion that this world is terrible, that humanity is terrible and worthy of condemnation, worthy of judgment. It's tempting to argue, too, that we aren't getting better. You know, we want to think, oh, well, we don't practice human child sacrifice like we used to. We're not holding witch trials and burning people at the stake like we used to. But it has been in our modern age that we have killed more of one another than in any other age prior. And it's because of our so-called advancements in technology, advancements in science. You know, we use those things to create nuclear weapons. We use those things to carpet bomb cities. We use those things for the Holocaust and killing millions of people. God's very good creation of the human has clearly fallen far from our origin. So what went wrong? In the Bible, we tell the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's a mythical story that explains how we understand what went wrong. You know, when God created us, he created us with the ability to love. For love to be sincere, though, it has to be freely given. It can't be forced. You know, you've seen the movies of genies granting a wish and says, I can't make someone love you, because it's not real love if they're forced to do it. If there's no choice, if there's no freedom, then what is given can never truly be love. So God created us in his image with the ability to love him. But to have that ability, we had to also have the freedom to not love him, to choose something else, to go a different way. And one way of showing love to God is obedience. And that's a tough word, and I know a lot of us don't like that word, obedience. It seems to infringe upon our freedom in some way, but think about it as loving obedience, like a parent inviting their child to make the dinner table, to set the table, put out the dishes, the forks and the spoons, the cups, all that, so that they can have a meal together. Parent commands the child to do that. Now the child has a choice. The child can lovingly obey the parent and set the table, and they enjoy a meal together, because that's part of what the command is. It's an invitation to participate in something good and to do your part. But the child could also disobey and say, I'm not going to set the table, or throw a fit, or make a fuss, or begrudgingly obey, anything less than perfectly loving obedience. And if the child does that, which they're free to do, well, the dinner's ruined. It's marred in some way. It's at least less than it could be. At most, it could be completely destroyed by argument and dissent. We are free to love God or not. God does not force anything, but invites us to trust him, to obey him, and to love him. Obedience is about trusting God's commands, that those commands are good for us. You know, when a parent says, don't touch the stove or it'll burn you, that's a loving command. And that's the kind of command that God gives us. God's commands invite us to participate in the world as God designed it. It's like he gave us a new iPad, brand new, straight out of the box, and he said, this is a gift for you, and this is how you use it. There's some things I don't want you to do with it. Don't use it as a cutting board. Don't put it in the dishwasher. These commands are not meant to restrict us in our freedom, but they are meant to show us how to use the gift that he's given us. It's the same thing with this world. God created this world. He created it in a specific way, and he gave us instructions on how to use it, how to thrive in the world that he gave us. But he also gave us the freedom to disobey, to go our own way, to choose to refuse God's commands and instructions, to not trust him, to not lovingly obey him and go our own way. And that's what the story of Adam and Eve is. It's a story where God puts the human in the garden, and he says, you can eat of all the trees that I've given you. The fruit is good for food, but not the ones in the center of garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat that one. Or the tree of life. Don't eat that one. And we disobeyed. We said, we don't trust God. We trust ourselves instead. We want to do what we think is right, not what God says is right. And we've chosen to use this world according to our own intentions, even though it goes against the way God designed it and created it. And as a result of these collective decisions to go our own way instead of God's way, to choose ourselves rather than loving God, well, we've broken the world. We've broken God's beautiful creation, just like an iPad would be broken if you put it in the dishwasher. And now, as a result of this broken creation, everyone who's born into this world is not born in the Garden of Eden, but is born in a broken world. We inherit this. We come into this world, as innocent as we may be as babies, we're still part of a sinful world and have to experience the consequences of the brokenness. This is what we Christians call original sin. We're born into a situation of sin where everything is broken. And we know that all the families that we are born into are broken in some way. Nobody, as much as we love our families, nobody's born into a perfect family. But we're born to parents who have their own issues and problems that came from their parents and all the way back. That's what sin is. Sin can be divided into two categories. There is the individual sins, things that we do that are wrong, and we need to pay the consequences of those sins. But then there is another category of sin that is situational sin, that is corporate sin, the sins that we've all committed together, regardless of what individual part we played, and we all experience the consequences together of that corporate sin. They may be sins our nation committed. Think of the United States. We committed the sin of slavery, and that was more than 100 years ago, but we all bear the consequences of that and are still trying to come to terms and identify how that sin of slavery so long ago still has ramifications on us today. And we're either perpetuating the sin of bigotry and racism, or we're fighting against it, but either way, we have to deal with it. We can't ignore it. I think of a good way to think of corporate sin is kind of like the use of asbestos as an insulation material in our homes. We may have had nothing to do with the decision to put asbestos in our homes, in our buildings years ago, but that doesn't matter. We still bear the consequences of it. We may get cancer as a result of living in those buildings, or we may buy a new home and find it has asbestos and we have to pay to get rid of it, or somebody has to pay to get rid of it. There has to be mitigation. We still need to be saved from it. Much of sin in the world is like this. It stems from corporate sin, original sin, situational sin, the brokenness of this world. It surrounds us, and we all have to pay the consequences of it. And it's also, when it comes to sin, too big for any of us to solve on our own. You think of the big topics of today, they're corporate sin, racism, climate change, immigration, poverty, hunger, inequality, terrorism, gun violence, war. These are all systematic. They're all bigger than any one person, and they all affect us, regardless of our individual participation in any of them. The difference between guilt and shame is another way to look at this. We talk about guilt, we think of people's individual responsibility for the thing that they did wrong. They messed up, they're guilty of that. But when we talk about shame, we may bear the shame of what somebody else did. Think of a parent who had a Ponzi scheme and hurt a lot of people, and we might have benefited from our parents' wealth, and when they get exposed, then we bear the shame of being part of that family and having benefited from their individual sin that they're guilty of, that we bear the shame of. If my country forces indigenous people off their land, and I live on that land today, I may not be guilty of forcing them off their land, but I bear the shame of it. And it's hard to know what to do about that. What do you do when you bear the shame of past sins? You see why Scripture says that we're all guilty, that all of our righteousness is like filthy rags? It's we're stuck in this situation, and we don't know how to get out of it. We can't get out of it ourselves. It's bigger than us. Many people struggle with this idea. We like the idea of individual accountability. Nobody should be guilty for what their parents did or their country did. But even if you look at that, and that's true too. There is individual sin and individual guilt, but that's a problem for us too, because we're not doing any better on the individual front. If you have children, you know that nobody taught them how to sin, right? As much as we think babies are innocent, I have twin 5-year-old girls, and they're beautiful and wonderful children, but they're also sinners, and nobody taught them how to sin. And it first came about, maybe a couple of years ago, when we would tell them, no cookies until after dinner. And what do? Well, they went and grabbed a cookie. And we caught them because, 3-year-olds aren't that great at hiding things. We said, no, you can't have a cookie till after dinner. Well, now they're older, and so they're getting a little better at sinning. And so they take the cookie still, knowing it's wrong, but now they're sneaky about it. And they sneak downstairs and they eat it in secret. And we catch them and we say, you cannot do this. And we punish them and we try to make them better. And still, they'll just find better, sneakier ways of continuing to sin. Nobody taught them how to do that. That was individual. It's part of who they are. And all of us are like that. All of us, we don't live up to God's standards for sure, as laid out in the 10 Commandments. But honestly, we don't even live up to our own standards. We set our own standards of what's right and wrong, and we fail to even live up to those. We are all guilty of our individual sin as well as corporate sin. We have broken this world that God created. And what are the consequences? The consequences of our sin, whether it's individual or original sin, our corporate sin, the consequences of that is death. We have introduced death into the world. We live in a world where people die. That is not the way God created this world. It is a consequence of sin. It is the natural result of breaking God's creation. I think of an analogy to think about this is a chip that I got on my windshield. Driving down the road, a rock hit it, and I get this little chip on the passenger side of my front windshield. And I mostly ignore it. I'm a little annoyed that it's there, but it doesn't really affect me. I can still see straight out. But then, as time goes on, I notice that cracks start spreading out from that little chip. And still it's on the passenger side, and now I'm starting to recognize this is a problem. It seems to be getting worse, but I can still ignore it. I was young when this happened, and I didn't have money to fix it, and so I tried to ignore it. But the cracks kept spreading. And I remember it was one cold morning, and I got up in the morning, and the crack had spread all the way across into my line of sight, that I had to get it replaced. The brokenness of this world, the introduction of death in this world is like that chip in the windshield. It shows up in many different ways, but it spreads. And the end is the same. The end is death. Every one of us will die. That's hard to come face to face with. We want to ignore it as long as we can, but eventually we'll start seeing our parents get sick and die, grandparents. Usually it's a grandparent that really introduces death to us and shatters our innocence. but we know it's coming for us too, that this death is spreading. And the crack of death spreads in every human life. It shows up in aging, it shows up in illness, it shows up in the decay of God's creation. You know, I'm 44 years old right now, just halfway through my life, maybe even a little less than half, hopefully. But I've already noticed there's decay going on in this body that, I have to use glasses now to read. I have a hard time reading paper without kind of holding it at a distance. I've noticed that when I wake up in the morning, it takes about an hour for my knees to wake up. And I go downstairs first thing in the morning, they creak a little bit and I go a little slower. I'm getting dark spots under my eyes. And I know some of you who are older than me are laughing and saying, just you wait, buddy. But it happens to all of us, right? This body that God has given us undergoes decay, and right out of the gate too. This is not the way God created the world. We are not meant to decay. We are not meant to get sick. We are not meant to die. And death is a problem. Death is our greatest enemy. It is the consequence of our sin. Death is not something to accept. It is something to fight against. And death is something, in the end, we need to be rescued from. We need to be saved from. When we talk about what is natural in this world, we have to be careful because there's this idea out there that, well, if it's natural, then it must be good. But that's not the case. I mean, viruses and illness and the decay of the body are all natural, but they're not good. They're not what God wants. Nature is infected with death. Nature itself. So when earthquakes come or tornadoes or here in Colorado, there's always the threat of wildfires. When those things come and they ravage the world and they kill people and cause damage and kill wildlife, those things are not good. That is not God's intention. That is a consequence of the brokenness of this world. We do not look on those things as God's actions, but we look on those things as the natural consequence of us misusing God's world and breaking the whole creation in ways that we could not even have imagined. And the same is true with the human person. Just because we're born a certain way doesn't mean God made us that way. Doesn't mean God intended that. I have 4 children, and my second oldest son was born with a broken heart, a hole in his heart, and born with Down syndrome, an extra chromosome. And all of these things affected him in very harmful ways. He had to have open heart surgery when he was just a couple months old. And that is not the way God made him. That's a brokenness right out of the gate. And he has a serious illness now that he's on constant medication for. And when I look at him, I know that God loves him, that God made him, but God did not break him, and that God did not create him in this broken way. God didn't do this to him. It is evidence of the brokenness of creation. Just as much as someone who is born with severe allergies that affects them their whole life, or someone who is born prone to anxiety or depression or any physical or mental or even spiritual ailment. These are not the way God designed us. They are evidence of the brokenness of this world. This world gives us glimpses of how God created it. We see the beauty of the earth and we know something's good, but we also must know that nature is not good in and of itself, but it is broken and it needs saving. So when the Christian talks about salvation, what we mean is we need to be rescued from sin, from death, and from the devil. I've talked about sin and death, and now I want to talk about a much more complicated subject, the devil. The devil has multiple names and descriptions in the Bible. He's described as a snake in the Garden of Eden. He's described as a fallen angel. He's described as a prosecutor. The word Satan means accuser. He's described as the enemy, as a roaring lion seeking to devour us. There are demons too in the Bible, things who possess people and cause harm to them. Most of those things we would describe in our modern age as illnesses of some sort, either mental or physical. It's hard to know then if the devil is an actual person or if the devil is more of a way to talk about the evil that is so evident in this world. Jesus talks about Satan as the ruler of this world, or as a strong man that needs to be bound in order for the world to be rescued. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure what to make of the devil, if it's a person or not. I'm not convinced that the devil is some red-horned creature with a pitchfork. I think there's all sorts of imaginations of the devil that has come to us through art and literature that aren't necessarily true. But I do think it represents something that is real in this world, and that's evil. There is evil in this world that is so pervasive and so against what we know is good and right, so depraved, that it's almost like it has a personality, like it has a power of its own. So where does evil come from? Now, we've talked about sin and how sin has broken this world, and our refusal to obey God's instruction, and how we've misused the gift of life and creation. And that sin has led to many consequences, including the introduction of death. And evil is kind of the accumulation of sin and those consequences, and the accumulation of death. I would say that evil, and perhaps the devil too, is really the momentum of sin. You think of a flywheel, how you have to push a flywheel over and over again to get it rotating, but eventually it catches, and then it has this momentum of its own, and it doesn't need to be pushed anymore. And I think evil is like that. We've been pushing sin into this world, and it's caught, and it's gained this momentum and gained a power of its own, and a personality too. Evil seems to run on its own. I was trying to think of a good example of evil, and there's unfortunately too many, but I think one of the most evil things I've read about recently is child soldiers. In Liberia and Uganda and Sudan, places like that, where there's these conflicts, and there's armies, and the stories are terrible, but I remember hearing one of an army would go into a village and kill the adults, and kids would see their parents killed in front of them, traumatized to the core. And then those kids would be co-opted into the army and given drugs and guns, and sent out into other villages to do the same thing. And it becomes this system, and kids grow up in that system, and then do what had been done to them to others. And that's, I think, what evil is like. That you could take any one of those kids out and interview them and say, what caused you? Why do you do this? And you wouldn't find pure evil in that child, even if that child had grown up to an adult and continued the same thing. But what they're doing is evil, and they're caught up in a system of evil that it's bigger than themselves, and it's hard to even trace back to a single cause. But it's got this life of its own, and it needs to be fought against, and we need to be delivered from it. There is evil in this world, and it comes in many forms. We talked about racism rooted in slavery that happened hundreds of years ago, but the consequences continue to reverberate throughout history. People can get caught up into it, and they can give themselves over to it. I think that's how evil works in this world. There's this momentum going on, and we come in contact with it, and we can either resist the evil or we can give ourselves into it. And when we give ourselves over to it, it's like we get caught up into that momentum, into that evil that's bigger than ourselves, and we perpetuate it. So how do we get free from something that's gone on for generations, something that's bigger than ourselves, something that has such power and history behind it? We need saving. We need a hero. We need someone to rescue us from this evil in the world. Salvation is deliverance from the consequences of this broken world, the consequences of sin. Salvation is deliverance from death and deliverance from evil. We need to be forgiven for breaking this world, and we need this world to be repaired, and we need the systems of evil to be interrupted permanently. And there's real pain that we've experienced as a result of this broken world, as a result of original sin, as a result of our individual sins, as a result of death, as a result of evil that we've experienced. There is real pain and hurt, and we need salvation from it. And the question is, who will save us? The question is, if we believe in God, will God save us? I mean, he doesn't have to. You think of things from God's perspective. He gave a good gift to this creation and we destroyed it. We're bearing the consequences of it. I mean, shouldn't we just have to bear that out? You know, you made the bed, sleep in it. God could give us over to it. God could start over, say, this is terrible. I'm starting over, destroying this creation, and maybe do another one, or maybe give up on the project altogether. Or God could decide that he wants to save us and is willing to experience personal consequences on God's self in order to rescue us. And of course, that's what we believe. As Christians, we believe that God has decided to rescue this creation from sin, death, and the devil. That's salvation. And that's what we'll talk about next week. Thank you.